Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Well, somehow I screwed up. I'm not sure how it happened, but I managed to miss several questions that y'all were kind enough to ask, and they are all really terrific questions from wonderful booktubers and viewers. I am so sorry. Let me remedy it right now. Here we are with the fourth installment of my 4K Q&A. The first question comes from Pat at the great newest channel Book Chat with Pat. She asks a set of questions. The first is about my experience as a teacher, something we share. She says, when you were teaching, what was your favorite course to teach? Well, my favorite college level class to teach was the history of slavery in the U.S. The students and I talked not only about the social history of slavery, but also about the way slavery has been studied over time. That is, what questions historians in different areas tried to answer, and how that could change in sometimes predictable and sometimes unpredictable ways. I also really loved teaching a Southern literature class with works by both Black and white Southerners to extremely gifted teenagers at a summer camp where I worked in the early years of graduate school. A friend of mine referred to the young students there as heinously gifted, and that was about right. Although the camp was only 3 weeks long, the students were in class with me all day and then had an hour of study hall with a teaching assistant right after an early dinner before the more typical camp activities they enjoyed for the rest of the evening. Many of the short stories and novellas I picked out to read together focused on childhood or growing up in some way, and it allowed us to talk about some difficult issues that frequently appear in Southern literature, including sexuality and race conflicts, in ways that might have been more difficult if the stories were about adults. I only taught it for a couple of summers, but it was one of my very favorite experiences, of the teaching experiences, but also of any other kind of experience in my whole life. Pat's second question is about my early reading. Do you recall any particular book that you read when you were a child or a teen that helped you see yourself as a serious reader? My mother was an English teacher, and she stored her old teaching books on the upper shelves of the bookcases in my childhood bedroom. I used to love to climb up there and pick out a volume to read. But the book I think I'll choose might be surprising, given that her shelves were primarily filled with classic novels. The book that made me feel like a really serious reader was a collection of Mother Goose rhymes. The reason it worked? Well, it was that it was very heavily annotated. And reading the annotations utterly transformed what I thought about those childhood rhymes. It also might have been the first time I'd ever read with such an investigative eye. Soon after that, I got really fascinated by the Norton Critical editions, with the texts of famous novels accompanied by the associated essays by critics and scholars. You might think that these experiences might have made me at least consider majoring in English and perhaps becoming a literature professor instead of a history professor. But I dismissed that option when I was in college because I was terrified to take advanced foreign languages, which were required for English majors. Long story there, which I will tell another time. Next, Pat asks if I have any books or authors that I repeatedly return to for comfort or reassurance. I definitely always feel calm when I pick up Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, and the newcomer to this list, Margaret Wrinkle's Late Migrations. The last two are calmer, I suppose, than Jane Eyre, and are more obvious comfort reads, but Bronte's book is such a part of my life, and it has been for so long, that there's pretty much nothing as comforting and reassuring as picking it up for another reread. Pat's final question is, who taught you how to knit, and are you working on any knitting projects now? My grandmother taught me to knit when I was a little girl. She was a magnificent knitter, and one of her sisters was a magnificent crocheter. They were quite a pair. Right now, I have two projects on my needles. One is a sweater, a fairly plain pullover that still needs arms. The other is a cabled scarf, a pattern I've knit a few times before, made with some special yarn I acquired on a very special trip a few years ago. I would show it to you or tell you more about it, but I'm knitting it as a present for someone that might possibly see this video. I started this particular project right now because I thought it would be easier to travel with than my mostly knit sweater. And I've been traveling quite a bit lately, so I can be in South Carolina with my brother and my other relatives and friends there as we clean out my mother's house. Jodi Howe asks a really wonderful question that has me wanting to turn a dream into a reality. She says, if you were to design a literary tour in the UK, what would that look like? I haven't yet planned things out in a way that makes any geographical sense, but I'm thinking about what I want to see in more chronological ways. I might need to figure this out for real at some point, and I'll need to ask for some of your help, some practical advice. But for now, just a whirlwind big picture. Maybe we can start things off, at least from the perspective of literary chronology, with a visit to Canterbury, where I assume I will reread some favorite tales from Chaucer, and tour the cathedral, and see the ancient city walls. Then perhaps Stratford-upon-Avon to see Shakespeare's home, and what I gather is sort of a literary version of Disney World. I would definitely want to see an RSC production there. Later in my trip, when I'm in London, I'll have to return to Shakespeare to visit the Globe and other sites. My husband and our Shakespeare-addled son visited in 2017, exploring as many Shakespeare-related sites as they could. I'll have to ask Abe for a list of his very favorites. But back to my rough literary chronology before I return to London. I think I'll head to Bath and dip into all things Jane Austen, including the Jane Austen Center there. And of course, I'll check out the ancient Roman baths there. I think there's a little town right nearby with well-preserved 16th century homes and gardens, and I'd love to visit that as well. And how about the Lake District, the home of William Wordsworth and his sister, whose writing I'm thinking about reading this summer. Perhaps while I'm in the Lake District, I'll also spend some time visiting Arthur Ransome and the characters he wrote about in one of my son's favorite series of books for young people, the Swallows in Amazon series. Then, of course, I'll have to travel to Yorkshire to see the home of the Bronte family and walk the cobblestone paths of their town, as well as on the moors. But there are other literary spots to visit in Yorkshire, too. James Herriot and all his creatures, great and small, for example. After watching the new screen adaptation, I think I may have to come dressed the part, in hand-knitted jumpers and the like, doing a little Yorkshire cosplay, as I've heard it described. And Anne Lister, the woman who wrote a detailed and coded diary about her love affairs with other women in the first part of the 19th century, was from West Yorkshire, if I remember correctly. Is that right? After spending some time with the Brontes, perhaps I will go see Elizabeth Gaskell in Manchester, rereading North and South while I'm there. And perhaps the most emotional part of the trip will be to Dorset, to the land of Thomas Hardy. If you asked me who I would name as my very favorite author, Hardy would be near the top of the list, perhaps even number one on so many days. I gather there is an official Hardy Trail introducing participants to the, quote, real Wessex. Then perhaps a visit to Oxford to see the university and the bookish street life, but also to visit haunts of the great detective Morse and Lewis Carroll and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and friends. And then on to London to finish the trip, visiting Bloomsbury, where Virginia Woolf and so many other writers and authors lived. And maybe going over to the Sherlock Holmes Museum, and then definitely paying homage to Charing Cross Road, where I will relive the love story between a British bookshop and an American woman. Are there ways to visit Trollope in London, or E.M. Forster? Of course, there is one more huge part of a trip to literary Britain, and that is meeting so many of you all, booktubers and viewers, who all feel like real friends to me now. So before I make any real plans, I'll have to figure out exactly where you all are. All of this is just really going to happen at some point. Thank you for letting me dream, Jodi. On to the next question. The Booked Escape Plan asks, even if you do write in your spare time, what compels you to make videos on YouTube as opposed to spending potentially more time on writing? One of the things that draws me most is the sense of conversation here, I think. That sense of working out ideas in community. That doesn't feel nearly as true, or at least not nearly as immediate when writing a book, especially now that I don't have a co-writer. I really like having both kinds of experiences in my daily life. I also really love having a dedicated place in my life where I play around with ideas about what I read, instead of just closing the book without as much of that post-reading reflection. And it's kind of new for me to put something together and throw it out in public without really rigorously editing it. I mean, I do edit my videos, but it's just a flyby removal of dead space and misspeaks, not the kind of intense editing I do to my writing. I know I spend more time planning my videos out in advance than some great booktubers who were much better at thinking on their feet and speaking off the cuff. Still, BookTube has helped me relax a little bit about sharing thoughts that might not be wholly formed yet. And I sort of think that more open approach has made it a little easier for me to write the kinds of memoir-esque prose instead of the academic prose that I'm trying to write right now. And finally, Heather at the lovely channel Heather Reads says the following. If you took an imaginative leap 5 years into the future, what projects might you like to have tackled on your channel? Great question. The most obvious is that I hope I will have found a way to post regularly and perhaps more frequently than I've been able to muster over the last couple of years. As I try to think of answers here, I keep thinking about what I'd like to do soon, this year and next year, like a series on ancient literature translated by women, which I mentioned in a recent video, or returning to War and Peace, or actually making some videos about the regionalist authors I've been reading. Another thing I'd really love to do is join in for one of Sarah's Author Spotlight series over at the channel Hardcover Hearts. She and other participants are about to read through several of Elizabeth Bowen's books, and I'm really tempted to join in. And I'm interested in making an occasional vlog where I take you around on adventures in DC, or perhaps a walk in the woods, perhaps even just document a day of cooking and work in the garden. I know that kind of video might not be especially appealing to my viewers, but I think it will be fun for me to try this kind of experiment. As for my longer-term plans for what to do here, I think the answer is that I'd like to keep things pretty open and just see where my life takes me and also how BookTube as a whole develops. Well, I think that actually completes the Q&A. Thank you all for joining me today, and definitely special thanks for the patience of those of you whose comments I misplaced. I hope you know how much I appreciate that you asked them to help me celebrate. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.